Hey friends, today's video is actually about something that started when I just picked up a few of the new Ryzen 4000U series laptops that have been coming out, and I noticed that there were some performance discrepancies that I couldn't account for, like this ZenBook 14, which has a Ryzen 5 4500U with an MX350, but it performed worse than this Ryzen 5 4500U laptop with no dedicated graphics card in certain scenarios. And I didn't quite understand why, especially considering the fact that this was 4266 megahertz RAM and this one was 3200. So I did some investigating and I finally figured out, at least from my preliminary analysis, something that's very important to the current generation of laptop purchasing that maybe hasn't been so important before, that you're absolutely going to want to pay attention to when you're looking for your next laptop. Because the key difference between the ZenBook 14 and this Lenovo Flex 5 is that even though they have the same exact processor, they actually have different types of RAM. The ZenBook 14 is on LPDDR4, which stands for low power, and then the Flex 5 is actually on full DDR4 3200. They're both dual channel RAM, and this was actually exacerbated by the fact that I saw on the Acer Swift 3, which has a Ryzen 7 4700U, it's 8 cores versus the 4500U 6 cores, that it actually was barely beating the 4500U on my Flex 5, even though it had LPDDR4 3200 megahertz. And so after doing some testing, I actually found out that there is a key thing that hasn't likely been important on Intel CPUs that now is important on AMD CPUs, and that is the latency of the RAM. And what I found is that the bandwidth, the total bandwidth of the RAM, is actually faster on these two laptops versus the Flex 5, but the latency of the RAM is actually faster on the full DDR4, which accounted for some performance increases that we saw on the Flex 5. So through all of my testing, the RAM latency on this Flex 5 with the 4500U DDR4 3200 was 98.9 nanoseconds. On the ZenBook 14, it was 113.77 nanoseconds, or 15% slower. The Ryzen 7 4700U with LPDDR4 3200, not 4266, actually had the worst latency of the bunch at 121.4 nanoseconds, or 22% worse than the Flex 5. And this accounted in actual worse CPU performance. And to some extent, in gaming scenarios, this is made up for by the fact that the 4800U has a better graphics card. The ZenBook 14 also has an MX350, therefore it performed better in some games, but in CPU-bound scenarios, it performed worse. So just taking a quick look at Cinebench scores, the Flex 5 had a great Cinebench score of a multi-core score of 936 with a single-core score of 175. The Swift 3 had a single-core score of 169, or 3% worse, and a multi-core score of 971, which is only 3% better despite having 33% more cores. It has 8 cores versus the 6 cores, but could only outperform the 6 cores by 3% due to that RAM latency. The 4500U on the ZenBook 14 had a worse single-core score with 161 and a worse multi-core score at 791. 8% worse on single core, 15% worse on multi-core. Once you start transiting the cores, the latency starts to add up and the performance becomes worse. I saw this repeated in a few other scenarios. In games like Valorant, it actually mattered quite a lot, where CPU performance actually mattered more than the GPU performance, because Valorant runs on a freaking potato. So on the Flex 5, we actually saw the highest FPS average because of the RAM latency and its better CPU performance, despite having less cores than the 4700U, and despite the ZenBook 14 having an MX350. It has a dedicated graphics card and it performed worse, coming in the Flex 5 at 135 FPS, the Swift 3 had 130, and the ZenBook 14 had 133. So the Swift 3 was 4% slower, the ZenBook 14 was 1.1% slower, despite having a dedicated graphics card. This didn't hold up in other games such as Fortnite, where it's more GPU dependent, the MX350 actually performing the best, coming in at 87 FPS, but when it was just integrated graphics between the Swift 3 and the Flex 5, The Flex 5 beat the Swift 3 by 10% despite it having a better GPU. PUBG is the only example of the things that I tested where the Flex 5 actually lost out, where it got 38 FPS average, the Swift 3 was 42, and then the ZenBook 14 with its dedicated GPU is 55. So in certain scenarios, this RAM latency issue doesn't seem to matter, but in more CPU-bound scenarios, this bottleneck is popping up. And the reason I think this matters, but hasn't really been discussed at this point, is because Intel wasn't latency sensitive. But these new Zen 2 Ryzen 4000U CPUs, we know are very sensitive to memory, and that is showing up in benchmarks, or at least in the benchmarks that I've been seeing. Comparing a Ryzen 5 4500U laptop to another Ryzen 5 4500U laptop, and just looking at the CPU specs is not good enough to understand the performance difference. There is up to a 15% gap in these two laptops because of their RAM. The ZenBook 14 technically has faster RAM. It's 4266. The low-powered RAM is causing higher latency and therefore worse CPU performance when you're using all of the cores. The 4700U with 3200 megahertz LPDDR4, while slightly better than the ZenBook 14, still is nearly neck and neck with a Ryzen 5 4500U, which has full DDR4 RAM. And so I think this video is just to say, make sure you check when you're buying a Ryzen 4000U series laptop, find out, does it have LPDDR4 or regular DDR4? Because that will actually have an impact on the performance and might not be something that the laptop manufacturers are going to fully express to you. And therefore, I just wanted to make this video kind of as a PSA. It's not that LPDDR4 is bad. The Swift 3 was only slightly more expensive than the Flex 5, and in certain scenarios, it performs better. The ZenBook 14 was less than my Flex 5, $50 less, even though it has an MX350. I got it on a good sale. So I'm willing to spend $50 less and get about 5 to 10% less performance in certain games because it was 10% less price. Just because a Ryzen 4000U laptop has LPDDR4 RAM doesn't mean that you have to throw it out. You need to consider the price implications with regards to something that might have fully fledged DDR4 like my Flex 5. So that's it. That's the video. Make sure you understand the difference. Up to 15% loss in multi-core scenarios, sometimes depending between LPDDR4 and regular DDR4. Let me know if you've heard anything about this, because I couldn't find any pre-existing videos or articles talking about this for that matter. And the last thing I could find was that it didn't matter between LPDDR and regular DDR because it's just a bandwidth issue. When was the last time you were bandwidth starved on a laptop? Well, now's the time. Zen 2 Ryzen architecture is actually making so it matters now. That's at least how I found it. Let me know if you have different explanations down below in the comments. I heard that it could be Infinity Fabric. I checked, it's not that, especially considering that the LPDDR4 3200 is running at the same IF speed as the regular DDR4 3200, and it still performed worse. So that's the explanation I have. Keen to hear from you down below. Make sure you check LP versus regular. Goodbye.